Welcome back to Leveraging Leadership, where we unpack the art of business leadership. I'm your host, Emily Sander, Chief of Staff turned Executive Leadership Coach. This show is all about finding your points of greatest influence and leveraging them to better serve those around you. Hallie Warner, how are you?
Hello, good. How are you?
I'm doing very good. I'm always impressed by your books in the background. For those of you who can't see, these are bookshelves that are color-coded and have, like, gradient levels of color per shelf. So that's what we have going on.
Yes. Books are very much my first love.
Clearly. And, like, did you come up with this color scheme? Do you have a designer do this? I've never seen this.
Oh no, I just did the Roy G. Biv.
Oh my gosh, that's impressive. Okay, I feel calmer just looking at your background. Anyway, Hallie, thank you so much for joining. Hallie is the owner and coach of Force Multiplier, which is a term we hear a lot, but she's here to talk to us about all things EA and how chiefs of staff and EAs work together and all of that good stuff. Hallie, for those of the listeners who don't know you, can you just do a brief introduction of your background and experience and where you're coming to things from?
Yeah, so for the past it's been about 15 years or so, I've been really in the executive support entrepreneurship space. Mostly worked with one entrepreneur for 13 years, but prior to that was an executive assistant, and then I was an executive assistant with working with him as well, and then moved about 3 years doing that, and then moved into a chief of staff role. And then since that, I have continued on that, EA chief of staff, in the EA chief of staff world, but specifically more on the coaching and consulting side. I do feel like, even though I'm not formally a chief of staff anymore, I am a force multiplier at heart. And like, that is what I do when I work with my clients, my one-on-one clients. That's what I do when I work as a consultant or a fractional chief of staff. Like, it's just who I am.
I think force multiplier is like a mindset. It's like an attitude more so than like a title or function.
I
But
agree.
yes, yes. So just for people's context, what does force multiplier do? You mentioned kind of the coaching and consulting, and I believe you have some different courses and training pieces coming out. But what is it that that organization does?
Yeah, so the basis of it was the book that I wrote with my former executive called The Founder and the Force Multiplier. And so the company really expanded from the book. So I did a lot of coaching, cohort, so small group coaching. When I was still as chief of staff, I did that through the Founder and the Force Multiplier company. Now I still do a bit of one-on-one coaching, but I am working on developing my on-demand, self-paced academy called the Force Multiplier Academy that will combine my love of force multipliers, my love of books, my love of learning. It's really a leadership, in my opinion, it's a leadership course for those who are in a force multiplier role, EAs, newer aspiring chiefs of staff, executive business partners, personal assistants, anyone who's that right hand partner to a leader. And yes, I skew a bit more towards entrepreneurs and small business owners simply because that's my background. But I hope that the information is just as applicable to individuals and large organizations as well.
Very cool. All right, so I definitely want to get into some different setups where chiefs of staff can work together with EAs at small companies, medium, large companies. There's lots of different factors that go into that. But just to kind of set the table here, you and I have talked about this many times before, but I think we're agreed, and you can confirm this, that I see an executive assistant role being very different than a chief of staff role. And certainly one can transition from an EA to a chief of staff, such as yourself, and do that very successfully. But it's also not like a given, like, okay, because this person's a good EA, they will become a good chief of staff. So just getting that out there and then getting your take on that.
Yeah, I think where it's more tricky between the EA and chief of staff is I think in smaller organizations because there is so much overlap. And on a small team, when you have, you've got your principal and you maybe have someone in finance, someone in marketing, someone in operations, and then you have an EA, and then you try to add a chief of staff, it's like, or you maybe don't even need a chief of staff. The EA is already kind of operating in that role much of the time because there is no one else to operate in that role. Or if you had just hired a chief of staff and not an EA in that scenario in a small business, well, then that chief of staff is operating as an executive assistant because, well, someone's going to have to. So I think it gets a little tricky in smaller companies, or if you're working like one on one with a principal, or again in a small organization. But yes, all things equal, and the organization is large enough or complex enough to necessitate both positions, they're very different. And we can go into those details if you want.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure, like, people to set the table and backdrop for people, like, that's where Hallie and I are coming from, and then within that, maybe we can talk about, a mid-sized company, even a large company where there will be EAs and there will be chiefs of staff and, like, plural in both cases, and, like, how do they partner together and how do they work together? Um, maybe a place to start is what kind of like org structures have you seen? I've seen like a group of EAs roll up to a chief of staff. I've seen a lot of dotted line situations where a chief of staff will be supporting, say, a CEO, and then they'll have an EA supporting the CEO, and then all of the C-suite executive team will have an EA as well, and it's dotted line to the chief of staff. There's loads of others, but like, what have you seen in this space?
Yeah, I was going to say all of that and so much more. Yeah, sometimes the EAs are all roll up to maybe a senior EA or an administrative manager. And in that case, the chief of staff might be a little bit more removed from the administrative functions because there might be an chief administrative officer or simply an EA manager. So I've seen that. To your point, I've seen EAs who directly report to a chief of staff, who also are reporting to their principal or working very closely with their principal, but sometimes also reporting to the chief of staff. Sometimes the chief of staff and the EA have very little. Well, they really should have a lot of interaction, but they're siloed. Sometimes they're siloed.
Mm, yeah.
Depends on. Honestly, there's so many like and ifs, and it depends.
Yes.
Because you're right. Like if there's a lot of chiefs of staff in the organization, maybe they are all reporting to one senior chief of staff or VP of. I was like VP of business operations or something like that.
Yeah.
And then the EAs are running a bit separately, and they're one on one with their executives, supporting them that way. So there's lots of different scenarios.
Totally, totally. Maybe we could talk about some of the factors that go into that, which are, like, infinite, but, like, we just cover the most common. I mean, like, company size, we kind of touched on. I think the nature of, like, the industry or organization might have something to do with it. Personality of, like, principal and what works best for them. What are the other things have you seen?
Yeah, I was gonna say a little bit to do with the size too. Like I say, like our business was like a small business, but yet my executive had multiple small businesses, so there was some complexities there. So, in I became the chief of staff, and we leveraged out so much of the EA responsibilities because there were so many other things going on in the organization that I could then pay attention to. The personality of the executive definitely. I think I was actually interested to hear your thoughts on this too. Like, what? Not all companies need a chief of staff, right? I mean, or do you feel like all companies do need a chief of staff?
I mean, not every single one, but I could probably make a strong argument that most companies or most executives can find a benefit in having a chief of staff. Um, but I think, that's it's if a person isn't ready to have a chief of staff and doesn't want a chief of staff, there's certain people who have that approach who wouldn't do well with the chief of staff. Now, I have had some principals who are like, "I don't want a chief of staff, but okay, I'll bring one on." And then they're like, "Oh my gosh, how did I live without a chief of staff all this time?"
I always am curious. Like in those examples, do they also have an executive assistant?
Sometimes. I mean, a lot of people who have had an EA, which is more common, will often confuse a chief of staff with, like, a high-level EA. I've heard, the term, like, EA plus. "Oh, yeah, chief of staff, like, EA plus, like a senior EA." I'm like, "No, no, it's not." But I've seen also the dynamic between an EA and chief of staff. Sometimes they're, like, simpatico, like, we are, like, lockstep, we're doing this thing together, and sometimes there's quite a lot of tension in between an EA and chief of staff because, like, depending on like who was there first in terms of tenure, in terms of like territory and people's like you're taking that's mine type of thing. I've seen that dynamic be uh, go in all sorts of directions, kind of every direction, every range on the spectrum type of thing.
Yeah, same. And I think when we were talking before about like that EAs should never report to a chief of staff is a common
Mm.
thought, but I actually don't necessarily agree with that because as we've just been talking about, it depends on tenure. It depends on the principal's desire to lead an additional. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't have a great relationship, the EA and the principal, but sometimes the workflow might come through the chief of staff.
Yeah, for sure. What do you think? Like, what makes you say the EA shouldn't roll to the chief of staff? Is it just because? Well, let me ask that question, then let you answer.
Well, that's what I hear a lot. I actually don't agree.
Ah,
Yeah, I don't actually
okay.
agree with that. And I think the common thought is, well, I mean, I can listen. I can see it both ways, and I think that it doesn't work if there isn't other mechanisms in order to have make sure that the EA is building a strong relationship and partnership with whoever they're supporting.
Yeah.
If the chief of staff ends up becoming a bottleneck, if things are slowing down, if the EA is not getting the context that they need, there's lots of reasons why they shouldn't report directly to the chief of staff. However, if they're getting all of those things whilst eliminating some of the pressure from the principal to have those conversations around context or around here's all the information that you need, I think it's a benefit for the EA to report to a chief of staff if it is saving the principal time.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I would be interested in your experience. First of all, when you were EA, was there a chief of staff or just there was no chief of staff? Okay, so you were like EA function, no chief of staff, and then you were promoted to chief of staff, and then did you have an EA?
My executive had an EA, but they did report to me.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And how did you
Well, I was just gonna say in those situations, I think it's interesting because if you are like an E or any role that you're kind of moving into a new position and you need to backfill your previous role, the thing in that scenario, my principal didn't need additional support. He was fantastic, right? Because I was fulfilling all of his needs. He didn't know there was anything wrong. I was doing chief of staff work. I was doing executive assistant work. Like it was fine. But there comes a point where I became the ceiling of our growth, and so I said, well, we need something. And so, do I move into a COO role and we hire you an EA? Do we just hire COOs for every single entity? Like, what are we going to do here? And after doing a lot of research around the chief of staff role and the COO role, I very clearly knew that my career path was chief of staff and not chief operating officer. And so I made that pitch, I proposed that, and yes, while in theory the EA was supporting him, it was really a leverage piece for me by making that hire because his life
Mm,
didn't really change drastically one way or the other. We were just able to grow much faster and more effectively by making that hire.
that's very cool, yeah. And I think back to your earlier point, if you start with a small company, and I've seen a lot of founders hire a chief of staff as one of their first 5 hires, which is amazing, and as you described, like, at that stage, everyone's doing everything. Like, you're it's all hands on deck, everyone's wearing multiple hats, and very often a chief of staff or someone like that will be fulfilling EA responsibilities and maybe COO responsibilities or what have you. But what you just said is made me think of as that company progresses and evolves, and those 2 roles become distinct, there may very well come a point where they split off into, "Okay, we now need to make a distinct chief of staff and EA and COO role with 3 different people because it's just to the scale."
Yes. And that's exactly, maybe, I was maybe not at a huge level, but on a smaller level, that's exactly what happened. We hired directors of operations, we hired an EA, so that I could continue to run alongside my highly entrepreneurial executive who was starting new companies, starting nonprofit, involved in other coaching programs, and very public facing. and we've started hiring directors of operations to run the operations and the day-to-day functions of the various businesses, because that was not actually my personality or his. We wanted to go build, grow, lead, but we needed somebody who's actually going to operate and run the business.
Yeah, for sure. What have you seen work well in terms of, like, the roles and duties of an EA and the roles and duties of a chief of staff? And let's just say, like, they're both reporting into the CEO in this capacity. Like, they're not reporting into each other, but they're collaborating and having to touch base on a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, I worked so closely with our EA. I mean, we did everything together. We were just doing different parts of it, essentially. And that's the same philosophy I take with the principal as a force multiplier. Is we have one very high impact job. We just are doing two different parts of it, and if you bring in an EA or you bring in a chief of staff, okay, you have one very high impact role. You are just each doing your pieces of it based off of your strengths. And so in this case with the EA versus chief of staff, I mean, I could have very well continued to be the EA if that was my strength and desire, and we could have hired a chief of staff. But that's just not, honestly, that's not where I am that good, is an EA role. So in those examples, the EA, of course, would be handling, I like to say, things that are a little bit more immediate. It doesn't mean that they're not planning long term. However, they have to be able to be highly adaptable, flexible, and responsive to whatever the needs of the day that week are. Without that, things fall through the crack. So yes, they're handling, logistics and scheduling and planning and all of the various things that go into doing that. Events, meeting prep, strat meetings, like all of the things. And the chief of staff, in my experience, is just focused more on long term items, like, and I would say filling the gaps. And that's what I did a lot in my role, was whether it's starting new companies, whether it was bridging the gap before we were large enough to make it a full-time hire, long-term planning, creating new programs, launching new products and services. Like, I might not have been the doer in all of those, but I was the one helping create the plan, orchestrate everything, keep everyone organized, on track, lead it, and then turn it over to the person who was going to actually run it. And again, as a chief of staff in our EA, we would work hand in hand on all of those things. So I might be creating this big, new coaching program that we were about to launch. My executive was the talent in that program. I was orchestrating the thing, and then our EA would come in and make sure all the logistics were handled. I mean, we all worked very, very closely together.
Yeah, I love what you said about we're doing one important job, we're just doing different pieces of it, and yes, I mean, in every instance I've seen, like, an EA is doing the immediate, quick, like, calendar or send this email out or draft this thing. I've seen a lot of EAs be also kinda like an office manager, and so for, like, that location, if you're talking logistics, it's like, can you make sure, like, the, AV and the screen and stuff work in the conference room because 'cause we're gonna have a group call with, this other location type of thing. Um, and then the chief of staff is doing the more, like, long-term, big picture, strategic pieces. But of course, there's, like, logistic and administrative support pieces that have to be done along the way, and someone has to do it or it just falls apart. So, I definitely resonate with what you said there. Is there anything else, like an example where you work with your EA and you were like, "Okay, here's my big project, and here's the touch points I would have with EA," or here, like, I would shoot them an email or shoot them a Slack or go down the hall and poke my head in and say, "Hey, can we do this, this, and this?"
Yeah, the one we did a 5 year leadership coaching. I think we ran it for 5 years. A very big leadership coaching program. It was a year long. We had usually about 25 to 30 people in it. They paid a lot of money. We met 4 times a year, off, not in our office, obviously, off site. There were speakers, there were activities, dinners, catering, like hotel, everything, AV, all the things that needed to go into transportation, handling all of that. And so, I mean, that was my baby, was putting that entire leadership coaching program together. And so, yeah, I usually created the overall agenda, was, thought through who are we going to be having for speakers. And I did this hand in hand with our principal, right? Like he gave me the big
Sure.
vision, and then I was like, okay, if you want to create this leadership coaching program, here's what I think we need to do, right? I go and I create the whole program, the plan, but I'm working hand in hand with REA, who I would meet with. We had regular meetings. She would check back in if there was any decisions that I needed to sign off on or make. But really, I would give her the logistical vision of what things needed to happen, and we would have kind of a project plan, and then she would get to work, scheduling the venue, handling, going back and forth with the caterers, making sure AV was taken care of, booking the speakers, handling all of the clients' requests because they needed special water on site. Like she handled all of that. And then we would meet very regularly throughout the year, to make sure things were on track for the project, for the program. And then of course, like before any large event, you're meeting a lot those couple of weeks leading up to it, all those final decisions that need to be made. But yeah, I mean, I was really kind of leading the charge on the vision and the programming, and I mean, I couldn't have done it without her, right? Like she did all of the legwork and then really made sure things on site were handled with the venue, with the food, with the catering, so that I could entertain. I say entertain, but really so I could be engaged in the conversations and be facilitating, and let's talk about leadership, and okay, let's talk about how's your business doing, like, and having those conversations while we were there, like on site.
Yeah, and that example made me think of we had like an annual event that we ran, and it was like a whole big it was our kind of capstone thing for the year, and I would watch our teams. And some people were just so good at, like, the hospitality stuff and, like, the flower should be here, and, like, this goes with this. I'm like, "That does go with that," and, like, I just don't see that stuff. I'm like, "There's no way I could do this. If I tried, it would be horrible." And so if you have people playing to their strengths to, like, thrive on that stuff and let me make this environment the way we want it to be. If it's, like, calm and soothing, or if it's, like, fun and exciting and innovative, like, loud. I mean, people can design that stuff, and a good EA can help orchestrate that part of it, which is huge. So I love what you said there, and then you're able to, like, go make connections with people and kind of not worry about, like, "Hey, the catering's doing this," or "The appetizers aren't out yet," type of thing. You're able to make those strategic connections.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I could not have done it without REA.
Yeah. Where have you seen, like, EAs and chiefs of staff not be set up well or not quite like, run into trouble? Like, where have you seen that take place?
Yeah, I'm curious also from your perspective. I feel like more often than not, it is a chief of staff coming in after an EA is already. So there's two scenarios. One is that there's already an EA and a chief of staff is hired,
Yep.
or then or I mean, I guess these are the two scenarios, or the EA often moves into a chief of staff role and then they have to rehire the EA. I feel like that one has unique challenges because the relationship between the chief of, and this is in my example, we already had I don't know, 3 4 year relationship, at 5 year relationship at the point where we brought in an EA. So in those cases, I think it is. I mean, I made sure that my entire role was making sure our EA was set up for success and was being coached. The challenge there was making sure that she or he had enough time to create a connection with the executive, and
Mm.
that I didn't always become the bottleneck, and that I didn't always get in the way. So I had to make sure that was little bit of a delicate dance. And then in the example, when a new chief of staff is hired and the EA has been there for a long time, I think the chief of staff again needs to come in and be come from a lot of curiosity, be there to develop the relationship first. Again, make sure that the EA and the executive are still maintaining their connection and their relationship, and being very willing to learn from the EA because they have a ton that they can share. And really, in both scenarios, what I'm basically saying here is making sure you are being highly collaborative while being also knowing very clearly where the roles are and what,
That's it.
yeah, the
It sounds
distinct
so
roles.
simple. It's like
Yeah.
it's easier said than done, but that's it. If you can do that, then you unlock that for that partnership.
Yes, and where does their roles and responsibility end? Where do yours begin? Vice versa. And then in that, how are we each supporting the principal? Because I think that's where it can sometimes get a little, not tricky, but like, there can be egos involved, and there's,
Totally.
office politics, and I have the relationship, or you don't know what's happening, or whatever. But that, you just have to commit to rebuilding the relationship. We're staying in our lanes. It's one big job. We're just doing different parts of it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like, in the first scenario you mentioned, where if someone was an EA and they moved into the chief of staff role, I mean, it sounds like you were pretty self-aware, where it's like, "I need to not be the bottleneck here, and I need to let this EA do their thing." Uh, where I've seen people trip up is they, like, try to hold on to the EA staff because 'cause they're like, "No, no, no, this is how you do it. Like, you do it right like this. I can do that. I know how." And they can't do it all, and they stifle the new EA who's trying to put their mark on the role. And then, I've seen the second scenario quite a lot where an EA has been there for a long, long time, and maybe they are taking care of some of the personal side of the principal stuff and the business side, so they're all ingrained with the principal. Chief of staff comes on board, and EA is like, "What are you doing here? Like, hold on, like, this is my principal," and they get pretty territorial. So, uh, and I'm wondering, like, where you see the principal in all this. I mean, my view is EA and chief of staff are trying to make the principal's life easier, and at the same time, principal has to share, like, their vision of how they think this is gonna work as well and say and be part of that conversation, so it's kind of a three-way conversation.
Yeah, I absolutely needs to be a three-way conversation. As you were saying that, all I was thinking, it was very challenging to have to retrain, not retrain, but train my principal to not always come to me for everything, and
Oh,
like
yes.
really, and that took some time. And of course, it always feels good that like I'm the go-to. However, that meant I continued to hold on to so many of those responsibilities, and I became the bottleneck. And so it was a bit of a process making sure that he was involved in the process of this, because again, he does not care who gets the work done. That's never on the principal's, generally not on the principal's mind, and certainly not in my case. Like, could care less who did the work as long as the result was getting hit.
Just get it done.
Yes. So he could tell whoever he wanted to, and as long as it was getting done, it didn't matter. So making sure that we did have channels of communication in place, and we really were discussing. And oftentimes we would have meetings, all the three of us together. Not all the time. I would say at least once a month we were just having a quick little like, are we all on the same page? Has anything changed? Let's make sure we're looking ahead for the next quarter. So that we're both hearing it directly from him about vision or any sort of things that may have shifted in the priority, not just my interpretation of it, even though mine was pretty good after, working together with him for so long. But yes, I think making sure that the principal is involved in those conversations, and being like, okay, here are the lanes. Me, EA, and chief of staff, we have decided here's who's doing what, and just helping to facilitate the principal remembering and helping hold them
Friendly
accountable.
reminder. Yes.
Yeah, to those frameworks that you've developed.
Totally, totally. I think too, like, I always see there's when someone goes from EA to chief of staff, they kind of have to rebrand themselves internally because everyone thinks of them as an EA, and rightfully so if they've done that for, like, 5, 7, 8 years, whatever, and all of a sudden they're chief of staff, and so it does take reminding, like, the principal, oh, yeah, sorry, okay, yep, this goes here," and, like, your other colleagues might route stuff to you, because they were used to doing that as EA. It's like, "Oh, no, sorry, yep, that goes to this person now." So it's just I mean, it's valid in some ways and understandable.
It's no one's fault. Again, everyone's just so busy. I'm a big believer, and no matter what role you're in, and I teach this to EAs all the time, like, you have to communicate your role to other people and let them know, like, you come to me for this is how I deliver results for you. Like, it's not their job, other people's job, to know your job.
Yeah, and I think, like, in the second scenario where an EA has been there and a chief of staff comes in, like, where I've seen this be successful, if the principal, like, outlines to has the conversation with those 2 people. So they have that three-way conversation, but then messages, like, in an email or a leadership meeting or whatever, to the rest of the team, like, "Hey, here's what these 2 roles are." and here's why I brought in a chief of staff. I think that helps people a lot. Um, yes. What other advice do you have for EAs, because this is your bread and butter stuff, about, like, how to be an exceptional EA?
Oh, I'm like, where shall I begin? There are a couple of like places to I mean, there's so many ways that you can be a great EA, but for me it comes down to leadership. And so I say that, but I really mean starting with your self leadership and leading yourself first. And to me that means investing in your education, reading books, listening to podcasts, learning the business, understanding how your executive thinks, making sure that your work is aligned with theirs, understanding the goals and priorities of the business, the goals and priorities of your executive. So for me, it's like leadership and partnership, and they go hand in hand, in my opinion. And so there's lots of to-dos to do in order to develop, obviously, leadership. But by doing that, I think you are positioning yourself as a strategic partner to the chief of staff, to the principal, to the leadership team. And I think that's really what, in my opinion, what EAs want. They want partnership, and they are amazing partners to have on the team. And so the way I think to develop that is starting with yourself and continuing to invest into learning and leadership development.
I love that your answer included leadership and partnership, because I don't think a lot of people would think of those 2 words after they hear EA. Like, when you're like, "Okay, think EA, what do you think of?" Like, I don't know if a lot of people would say leadership and partnership, but that's so true, and there's different facets and layers in there. And of course, I love the continuous learning bit. I mean, invest in yourself and, what your motivation and your education and, all of those different types of things, but thank you for teeing it up like that. Um, any other misconceptions about EAs that you've seen thrown around and you're like, I would like to dispel those?"
Oh man, the biggest one that we hear all the time, and I'm sure you hear it too, is EAs are tactical, chiefs of staff are strategic. I think that is it's just not it's only 50% true, right? Because EAs are tactical and strategic, and chiefs of staff are tactical and strategic. They both are. I know it's an easy way to like delineate the roles, but I think it doesn't give EAs or chiefs of staff enough credit for all of the work that goes into really operating in those positions at a really high level.
Yeah. If you were talking to an EA who wants to one day become a chief of staff, maybe they got a entry level job out of college and they're learning the company and the team and business and all this, but one day they have their eye on chief of staff. What advice would you give them in terms of, like, how to show up and what types of opportunities to look for and all those different types of things?
Yeah, I think one thing that immediately comes to mind is around leadership. I know I said that a lot, but it is interesting. I find that there's a difference, I think, in general in an organization between being more of an individual contributor and being a people manager, like a leader.
Totally.
Like anyone can be a leader in their own right and in their role, and you can lead projects and you can lead through influence. I'm not saying that. I mean, like in a more formal position. And I know chiefs of staff don't necessarily always have direct reports, but they need to absolutely be okay, and want to learn how to succeed through other people rather than on their own individual efforts. And I think that that's, again, regardless of the role, feel like there's some distinction there about your personal preference about how you want to work. Do you want to work solely based off of your own contributions and your own efforts, or are you, which I don't say isn't always an EA, but very often is more of an EA. Like you kill it in your role, you are providing stuff at an incredibly high level, but you're not necessarily 100% dependent on other people getting their work done. You might be helping facilitate it, but it's not quite to the level, in my opinion, as a chief of staff, where pretty much your entire role is based on making sure that you're helping to facilitate and influence other people or lead other people either directly or indirectly. So I think you have to know yourself and be honest with yourself about whether or not what type of career you want in general. And if you like leading other people and having to wait around for them to get back to you and hold other people accountable, it's not for everybody.
No, it's not. I think that's a good question. Like, what type of leader do you want to be? There's lots of different types of leadership, and the world and companies need all sorts of them. So, what leader do you want to be? And don't force yourself into a role that you think you should do and you're not suited for when really your strength is over here. You can contribute in such an amazing way over here. Um, so as we wind down here, I know we've covered a lot of ground. Um, and somehow almost like just the tip of the iceberg in this topic. But is there anything else you want to get out there in terms of like people need to know this about EAs or about this about chiefs of staff or force multipliers? What's your main message you want to get out to people?
Yeah, and I think we started off by talking about it a little bit. Maybe this was even off camera, but that to me, it's a being a force multiplier is a mindset, and it is not about a title. And yes, there are I believe in having incredibly clear titles and clear job descriptions. And yet, in the very entrepreneurial world and environment that I have operated in for a long time, like titles mean different things to different people at different companies. And
Oh
yet,
yeah.
to me, a force multiplier spans many different titles. And for me, it is whoever is the right hand partner to a leader, to the principal. And sometimes that comes in the form of an EA, sometimes that's the form of a chief of staff, sometimes it's both, sometimes it's a founder's associate or a personal assistant. And regardless, for me, it all goes back to the idea of being a force multiplier, adopting that mindset, which is to take the vision and priorities of an executive and ensure that they are communicated, organized, delegated, and executed across the rest of the organization. And there's lots of things that go into doing that, and ways of approaching it. But that's what a force multiplier is. You're maximizing and enhancing the vision and ensuring that it gets done.
Beautiful. Last question for you. You said you're a bibliophile, and you can see that from your background. What are some of your favorite books just for yourself or like recommended books for other people?
Yeah, Fierce Conversations by Susan Scott is one I read regularly. Multipliers and Impact Players by Liz Wiseman. I love High Performance Habits, Essentialism.
Yes.
4,000 Weeks is great by Oliver Berkman. I love that book. Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke is
Yes.
fantastic. Oh gosh, it really depends. Like those are some of like my top that I would recommend almost to anybody in like a force multiplier role. And then there's always a book for anyone's problem, in my opinion. If you have a problem or a challenge or you're trying to learn something, there is a book for you. So I always say, let me know what you're trying to learn. Let me know what problem you're trying to solve, and I'll have a book recommendation for you.
If people want to reach out to you for that book recommendation or anything else they've heard with you or Force Multiplier, what is the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, my email, Hallie@HallieWarner.com, is perfect.
Okay, and we'll have that in the show notes for anyone listening. But Hallie, thank you so much for joining and really appreciate this conversation and everything that you're doing with Force Multiplier.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.